The chief surgeon set my coffee down on the conference table, looked at the room full of department heads, and said, "Let's keep the patient safety briefing focused on people who've actually held a scalpel for more than a residency." Then he smiled at me, the way you'd smile at a kid who'd wandered into the wrong classroom. "Maybe you can take notes for us, Han. There were maybe 20 people in that room, and most of them found something fascinating to look at on their phones. A couple of them laughed under their breath. I felt my face go hot, but I kept my hands flat on the table and didn't move. I was 31 years old, board certified in trauma and critical care, and I had logged more emergency intubations in 2 years overseas than half the men in that room would see in a career. He didn't know that. He didn't know I was the reason his wife walked out of an ICU 4 years ago instead of getting wheeled to a morgue. And he had no idea I wasn't the kind of person who lets a thing like this slide. If you've ever been talked down to in a room full of people who knew better, if you've ever had someone decide who you were before you opened your mouth, stay with me. This is the story of how I made a man who thought he owned the truth hand it back to me in front of everyone who mattered. I want to back up, because the way you walk into a place tells you everything about how they've already decided to treat you. I've been recruited to Meridian St. Anne's, a big private hospital network in the suburbs north of Denver, to run the new trauma protocol overhaul. It was a real job, a serious one, with a contract and a title and a parking spot that had my name stenciled on it. I'd spent the previous 6 years split between a Level I trauma center in Houston and 3 deployments with a forward surgical team, the kind of work where you operate by headlamp, and the floor is dirt, and the only monitor you trust is your own 2 fingers on a wrist. I came home wanting something steadier. A house. A dog, maybe. A life that didn't smell like diesel and blood. The man who ran the surgical department was named Gideon Thorne, chief of surgery, 26 years at St. Anne's, the kind of man who had a wing named after a donation he'd shepherded and who walked through the halls like the building owed him rent. The first time I met him, he shook my hand for exactly 1 second, glanced at the badge clipped to my coat, and said, "Trauma overhaul, right? The grant project." Like I was a line item. Then he moved on to talk to a man behind me about a golf tournament. I told myself it was nothing. New place, busy man. I'd earn my footing. The thing about being underestimated is that it doesn't announce itself with a slap. It arrives in 1,000 quiet little ways. In meetings, when I'd lay out a protocol change, he'd wait until I finished and then turn to one of his senior attendings and say, "What do you think? Real world," as if I'd been describing a fairy tale. He scheduled the safety committee for 7 in the morning and then started at 6:45, so that I'd walk in to find decisions already made. When I sent data, he forwarded it to a junior resident to double-check the numbers, a resident who, I later learned, had been told to find a reason to question them. I want to be fair. I've worked with a lot of arrogant men, and most of them are just insecure boys in expensive shoes. I figured Thorne was one of those. I figured if I kept my head down and let the work speak, the climate would change. It didn't. It got colder. There was a nurse on the trauma floor, a charge nurse named Dolores Vinstek, who'd been at St. Anne's for 19 years and had seen every chief come and go. She found me one afternoon in the supply room, restocking a cart by myself because nobody had shown me where anything lived. She didn't say much at first. She just started handing me things, the right gauge needles, the kit I'd been hunting for, and then, real quiet, she said, "He does this. Every time. Brings in somebody smarter than him, and spends a year proving they're not." She looked at me with these tired, kind eyes. "You're the first one who didn't fold by week 2. People notice." That was the first time since I'd arrived that I didn't feel completely alone. I want you to remember her because she matters later. The worst of it came in October. We had a teaching session, a mortality and morbidity review, where the department goes over a case that went wrong and tries to learn from it. Thorne ran these like a courtroom, and he loved an audience. The case that week was a young man, 22 years old, who'd come in from a motorcycle wreck and died on the table during a vascular repair. A bad case. A sad one. Thorne pulled it up on the big screen and walked the room through it with his hands in his pockets, slow and theatrical, and then he turned to me. "Doctor," he said. He always said it like the word had quotation marks around it. "Our trauma expert. Walk us through what you'd have done differently, since you've seen so much." It was a trap. I knew it was a trap. He wanted me to second-guess the surgeon who'd lost the patient, in front of that surgeon, so I'd make an enemy and look like a know-it-all in the same breath. So I didn't take the bait the way he wanted. I stood up, walked to the screen, and asked to see the timeline. The real one, the minute by minute, and as I read it, something snagged. The blood pressure had been dropping for 11 minutes before anyone called for additional product. There was a gap, a delay, and the delay wasn't the surgeon's. The order for the massive transfusion protocol had been placed and then held by someone in administration flagging a cost authorization because the kid had come in without insurance and his identity hadn't been confirmed yet. I said that carefully. I said the surgeon at the table did everything right with what he was given and that the system failed him. That somewhere between the OR and the blood bank, a human being decided that a question about money was more urgent than a question about a pulse. The room got very quiet. Thorne's jaw tightened. He thanked me in a clipped voice and moved on, and I knew, the way you know weather is coming, that I had just stopped being an annoyance and become a problem. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and thought about that 22-year-old, and about the 11 minutes, and about who had the authority to put a hold on a transfusion. And I kept coming back to one thing. Thorne hadn't just been hostile that day. He'd been nervous. I started paying attention differently after that, not as the new hire trying to fit in, but as someone reading a scene the way I'd been trained to read a trauma bay. Fast, cold, looking for the bleed you can't see. Dolores helped, though I never asked her to put herself at risk. She just started leaving things where I'd find them. Old policy memo here. A name there. She told me, over bag cafeteria coffee, that there'd been a cluster of cases over the past 2 years. Uninsured patients, trauma cases, all with these same strange delays, and that a couple of nurses had filed concerns through the proper channels and watched those concerns evaporate. One of those nurses, she said, had been transferred to a satellite clinic 40 miles away. Quietly. With a small raise, so it didn't look like punishment. I want to be honest about something. There was a moment sitting in my car in the parking garage with all of this swirling, where I thought about just leaving, finishing my contract, keeping my head down, taking the reference and going somewhere that didn't make my stomach hurt. I'd done my fighting overseas. I'd earned a quiet life. Nobody would have blamed me. But I kept seeing that timeline, 11 minutes. And I knew that if I walked away, the next kid who came in without a wallet would get the same 11 minutes, and the one after that. And the only thing that would have changed is that nobody in that building would ever ask why. So I stayed. And I started pulling threads. The hospital kept its quality review data in a system I had legitimate access to. It was literally my job to study outcomes. What I didn't have access to was the administrative side, the authorization logs, the part that would show whose name was attached to those holds. But I had something Thorne didn't think to account for. I had time, and I had patience, and I had a nurse who'd watched everything for 19 years and forgotten nothing. What I found, piece by piece, over about 6 weeks, was this. St. Anne's had quietly adopted an internal cost containment policy a few years back, never written down in any way that could be traced, communicated in meetings and verbal directives, that flagged high-cost interventions for unverified or uninsured trauma patients. A flag wasn't supposed to be a delay. On paper, it was just a notification, but in practice, somewhere in the chain, those flags were being treated as holds, and those holds were costing minutes that trauma patients didn't have. And the person who'd championed the policy, who'd presented it to the board as a brilliant piece of fiscal stewardship that had saved the network millions, was Gideon Thorne. That was why he'd been nervous in that M&M review. The case I'd dissected wasn't an anomaly. It was his policy, working exactly as designed, killing a kid in front of a room full of doctors who'd been trained not to look too hard at the part of the chart where the money lived. I didn't sleep much that month either. Here's where it turned and where it got dangerous. I made a copy. Just the outcomes data, the timeline patterns, the anonymized pattern of delays correlated with insurance status. Everything I could legitimately reach. I didn't touch anything I wasn't authorized to see. I was careful about that because I knew that the second I crossed a line, the line would become the whole story, and the 11 minutes would disappear. And then Dolores got pulled into HR. She called me from the parking lot, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from her. They'd told her there'd been concerns about her professionalism. 19 years, spotless record, and suddenly there were concerns. They offered her a transfer to the same satellite clinic 40 miles out, with a small raise. I knew that script. I'd just learned it. Don't sign anything, I told her. Please, just don't sign anything yet. Give me a week. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He's going to come for you next, you know that." And I did know. I'd known since October. The next morning, it came. 2 people from administration were waiting outside my office, not HR, the legal office, and they informed me, very politely, that I was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into unauthorized handling of protected information. My access badge would be deactivated. I was to surrender my hospital laptop. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so clumsy and so familiar. He was using the system the way he'd used it for years, the way that had always worked. Make the problem person into the problem. Frame the question so that I became the violation. What he didn't know was that I'd already made my move. 3 days before, I'd done the one thing my whole career had trained me to do. When the situation is hopeless, I'd gone outside the chain of command. I had taken the pattern, not the protected data, just the pattern, the outcomes, the 11 minutes repeated across 2 years. And I'd filed a formal report with the State Health Department's Patient Safety Division and the hospital network's own board of directors, the actual board, not the administrative wall Thorne hid behind. And I'd CC'd the one body that a man like Thorne could not intimidate, deflect, or transfer to a satellite clinic, the accreditation council that held the entire network's federal certification in its hands. I'd sent it from my personal account, on my own time, as a licensed physician fulfilling a mandatory reporting obligation. There is no policy in any hospital in this country that can punish a doctor for that. Thorne, in all his 26 years, had gotten so used to making things disappear inside the building that he'd forgotten there was an outside. The hearing happened 6 weeks later. Not an HR meeting, a full review, convened by the board, with a representative from the state and a quality and safety officer from the accreditation council sitting in. They held it in the big boardroom on the top floor, the one with the view of the mountains, and the irony of that view was not lost on me. I walked in expecting a fight. I'd brought everything. The timelines, the pattern, Dolores's quiet years of observation distilled into something undeniable. I was ready to be cross-examined, to be painted as a disgruntled outsider who couldn't handle a real hospital, to have my deployments turned into a story about somebody who saw enemies everywhere. They asked me to speak first. I stood up, and I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't accuse anyone of murder. I just told them about 11 minutes. I told them about a 22-year-old whose name I'd memorized. I told them what a flag is supposed to be and what it had become. I laid the pattern on the table, and I let it sit there. And I said the only thing I'd come to say, that the most sacred promise in medicine is that when you are bleeding on our table, we do not stop to check your wallet. And that somewhere in this building, that promise had been quietly rewritten to include an asterisk. Then they turned to Thorne. I'd braced for the counterattack. Everyone in that room had. He was a man who topped his way out of everything for a quarter of a century. They expected him to dismantle me. He stood up slowly, and he looked older than he had in October. Gray, somehow. Like a man had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just felt his arms give out. He didn't look at the board. He looked at me. "Is the data accurate?" the lead board member asked him. There was a long silence. And then Gideon Thorne said, very quietly, "Yes." I heard somebody behind me draw a sharp breath. I told myself it was good stewardship, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. I told myself I was protecting the institution. The network was hemorrhaging money on unreimbursed trauma care, and I built a system to slow the spending, and I convinced myself that a flag was just a flag. He stopped. His hands were trembling. I knew, after the second case, I knew what it was doing. And I told myself the numbers justified it. And when he nodded at me, just barely, started asking the right questions. I did everything in my power to make her the problem instead of the policy, because it was easier than admitting what I'd built. He sat down. He looked like the chair was the only thing holding him up. I had spent months hating that man. I had rehearsed in the shower, in my car, a dozen speeches about everything he'd done, and in that moment, watching him fold under the weight of his own confession, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief. because he hadn't started as a villain. He'd started as a man who let a spreadsheet talk him out of his oath, one decimal point at a time, until he couldn't find his way back. The board didn't deliberate long. The cost containment flag policy was abolished that afternoon, effective immediately, network-wide. The Accreditation Council opened a formal review that would change protocols at every hospital in the system. The investigation into my unauthorized handling was dismissed before I'd even sat back down. There had never been anything to it. And Thorne, the board could have buried him, and a part of me, the part that had sat in that parking garage with my stomach in knots, wanted them to. Instead, they did something I didn't expect. They stripped him of the chief title. They removed him from all administrative and budgetary authority. And then they assigned him, this is the part I still think about, to spend his remaining years at St. Anne's helping build and teach the new patient safety curriculum. The very thing his policy had violated, he would now spend the rest of his career defending. His mistake became his sentence, and his sentence became his purpose. Dolores never signed the transfer. She's still on the trauma floor, training the new charge nurses, and the satellite clinic exile that had been waiting for her got quietly forgotten. The nurse who'd been transferred 2 years earlier was offered her old job back. She took it. I'd love to tell you that I walked away glowing, that it felt like winning. It didn't, not exactly. What it felt like was setting down something I'd been carrying for a long time, longer than just these months, maybe since the first time someone overseas looked at me with the dust and the blood and the noise all around us and decided I couldn't be the one in charge. A few weeks after the hearing, I ran into Thorne in the hallway outside the OR. He was carrying a stack of binders for the new curriculum, and he looked, honestly, lighter than I'd ever seen him. We stopped. There was that awful pause where neither of you knows whether the past is still standing in the room. I owe you something, he said. Not an apology. You don't want one, and I don't have the right. He shifted the binders. But thank you for not letting me get away with it. I needed someone to not let me get away with it. I just didn't know it. I nodded. There wasn't much to say. We both learned the same lesson from opposite sides. For what it's worth, he added, you'd have made a hell of a chief. And then he gave me the small, tired half-smile. You still will. I did eventually. Not at St. Anne's. I finished my contract there and moved on, the way I'd always planned to. But the trauma protocol I built became the model the whole network adopted, and a version of it is hanging on the wall of more than a few emergency departments now. There's a line in it I wrote myself, the first principle, before any of the clinical steps. It says, the patient's identity, insurance, and ability to pay are not factors in the speed or scope of life-saving care. Ever. People ask me sometimes why I stayed and fought when leaving would have been so much easier. I tell them about the 11 minutes. I tell them that I came home from places where I watched people decide who was worth saving, and I could not bear to find that same arithmetic waiting for me in a clean hospital with mountains out the window. They called me a lot of things that first year. The grant project, the trauma expert, in quotation marks, Hun. But the only thing I ever wanted was the thing I said in that boardroom, the thing that's hanging on those walls now, that when you're bleeding on our table, nobody gets to stop and check your wallet first. Not even the man who runs the place, especially not him. For a long time after I left St. Anne's, I kept coming back to those 11 minutes. Not the hearing, not the title they tried to take from me, not even the moment Gideon Thorne finally said yes in front of the board. Just the 11 minutes a 22-year-old waited, while a machine somewhere decided whether his pulse was worth the cost. That's the thing I built the rest of my thinking around. What I understand now is that none of it happened by accident. Thorne didn't wake up one morning a cruel man. He let a spreadsheet talk him out of his oath, one small concession at a time, and every time he chose the easier number over the harder truth, he made the next bad choice a little simpler. That's how it works. The cause is always smaller than the consequence, but the consequence always arrives. He flagged a policy, then defended it, then hid it, then tried to bury me to keep hiding it. And each link in that chain was forged by the one before. I didn't beat him. His own choices did. I just refused to look away from them. And that, I think, is the part worth holding on to. Because the night I sat in that parking garage wanting to quit, the easy thing and the right thing were standing in two different directions. And the only reason I walked toward the harder one was that I'd already decided what kind of person I wanted to be when no one was watching. That decision came first. The courage to file the report, the patience to spend 6 weeks pulling threads quietly instead of exploding in a meeting. The refusal to cross a single line that would have turned the story into my crime instead of his. All of that came out of one steady commitment to do the decent thing even when it cost me. But being decent isn't enough on its own. If I'd been honest and stupid, Thorne would have buried me in a week. What saved that 22-year-old's memory was reading the room the way I'd been trained to read a trauma bay. Slow, cold, looking for the bleed nobody else could see. And what carried it across the finish line wasn't brilliance or goodness. It was the plain stubbornness to keep standing back up. Dolores taught me that without ever saying it. 19 years she watched and forgot nothing, and when the moment came, she didn't fold. So if you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Decide who you are before the pressure arrives, because you won't have time to decide once it does. Sharpen the way you see, because good intentions with dull eyes get people killed. And when they try to make you the problem instead of the truth, and they will, just keep getting up. The man who runs the building is counting on you to sit down. Don't.